What if everything you believed about the origins of Christianity was deliberately engineered to hide an uncomfortable truth? A hidden truth so old, rooted not in beautiful Judea, but in the beautiful but mysterious temples of ancient Egypt.
Long before Jesus walked the earth, Egyptian priests were performing resurrection rites, rituals like Spell 168 from the Book of the Dead, spoken incantations designed to command divine forces directly. In these ceremonies, the priest didn't ask for miracles. He triggered them. No intermediaries, no saviors, no priesthood standing between humanity and the divine. Only the human voice and the power it could summon. And when Christianity began to rise, it didn't emerge into a spiritual vacuum. It stepped into a world already saturated with sophisticated magical systems, death and rebirth traditions, and centuries of ritual knowledge that offered ordinary people a direct link to the gods. That was a problem, because the early church didn't just want followers, it wanted exclusivity. So it didn't merely compete with these ancient practices, it moved to erase them systematically, quietly, efficiently. Entire categories of Egyptian magical texts, resurrection manuals, and priestly spellbooks were outlawed. Many were destroyed. Others survived only in fragments, and the rest were buried under a mechanism few modern people have ever heard of. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a centuries-long blacklist of forbidden works that shaped the spiritual history of the West. What was removed, what was silenced, and why. Tonight, we're going to peel back that veil. We're going to trace a hidden lineage of resurrection, magic, and suppressed knowledge that connects Egypt's most powerful rituals to the earliest foundations of Christianity. Stay with me. This is a story you were never meant to hear. The most prominent target of this systematic transformation was Thoth, the ibis-headed deity who commanded authority over hieroglyphs, mathematics, and the fundamental principles governing cosmic order. Egyptian theology positioned Thoth as the embodiment of divine intellect and the keeper of all sacred knowledge. His followers believed that words held the raw language of creation and that the right written formulas could change the laws of nature to fit God's will. The priests of Thoth passed down knowledge that had been hidden in layers of symbols, poetry, and sacred songs for hundreds of years. They believed that learning constituted a form of worship, that curiosity could draw practitioners closer to divine truth, and that knowledge represented the most sacred gift the gods could bestow upon humanity. This theological framework positioned individual seekers as capable of direct divine communication through proper understanding of symbolic language and mathematical principles. When early Christian theologians encountered Thoth's profound influence across Mediterranean spirituality, they recognized they could not simply erase such a deeply embedded spiritual figure. The Church's response was calculated and strategic. Medieval demonology texts reveal deliberate efforts to recast Thoth's wisdom-bearing function as fundamentally deceptive, portraying any divine knowledge existing outside Church authority as inherently corrupted. The Church called Thoth and his followers servants of darkness. And some early Christian writers said that Thoth was a demon working in disguise. This transformation involved more than theological repositioning. Medieval manuscripts demonstrate that Thoth's distinctive ibis-headed imagery directly influenced early depictions of fallen angels, especially those linked to forbidden knowledge and occult learning. This visual transformation enabled Christian artists to preserve the psychological influence of Thoth's appearance while reinterpreting his significance within Christian theological contexts. The Church systematically inverted Thoth's attributes, transforming the divine messenger and keeper of sacred knowledge into a fallen angel associated with forbidden and dangerous learning. The Church's suppression efforts extended beyond theological arguments. Scrolls containing Thoth's teachings were burned, temples dedicated to his worship were systematically destroyed, and the names of his priests were deliberately scratched off tomb walls. Some priests anticipated this persecution and disguised their teachings in Greek philosophical language, buried texts in remote desert caves, and passed secrets through whispered riddles to preserve essential knowledge. The Vatican maintained secret archives containing documents that mentioned Thoth explicitly, including spells written in ancient Coptic and star charts that defied contemporary astronomical understanding. The Church's demonization of Thoth revealed their recognition that his archetype of direct divine communication fundamentally threatened the necessity of priestly intercession. If individuals could access divine knowledge independently through study and proper understanding, the institutional framework of Christianity faced existential challenges. This strategic pattern of spiritual identity theft would be systematically applied to other Egyptian deities, but none would prove more threatening to Christian doctrine than the gods who had already mastered the ultimate mystery that Christianity claimed as its own unique revelation. That mystery was resurrection itself, and Egyptian priests had mastered its secrets millennia before Christianity emerged. Spell number 168 from the Book of the Dead provided explicit methodology for overcoming death through systematic transformation, while related incantations offered step-by-step guidance for navigating afterlife realms and emerging victorious over mortality. These sacred papyri documented precise ritual sequences designed to restore consciousness, rebuild the spiritual body, and achieve permanent existence beyond physical death. Egyptian funerary practices centered on sophisticated techniques that bore uncomfortable resemblances to later Christian resurrection narratives. The opening of the mouth ceremony employed specific ritual implements, including ceremonial adzes and serpent-headed wands, to restore life force and consciousness to the deceased through carefully orchestrated spoken formulas. Priests understood these procedures as practical applications of divine science rather than symbolic gestures, believing that proper execution could literally reanimate the dead and grant them access to eternal existence. The chronological implications proved devastating for Christian claims of unique revelation. Egyptian texts described 3-day transformation periods during which the deceased underwent complete spiritual metamorphosis before emerging into immortal existence. Divine judgment scenes featured the weighing of souls against moral standards, with the righteous receiving eternal life while the unworthy faced destruction. These elements mirrored core Christian doctrines with such precision that early Christian scholars who encountered these texts during their expansion into Egyptian territories recognized the theological crisis they represented. The fundamental problem extended beyond mere conceptual similarities. Egyptian texts provided detailed practical instructions for achieving resurrection through human knowledge and ritual application rather than divine grace alone. This framework suggested that death could be conquered through proper understanding and technique, positioning priests as facilitators of resurrection rather than passive recipients of divine mercy. Such understanding directly contradicted Christian emphasis on salvation through faith and institutional mediation. Church authorities implemented calculated suppression strategies to prevent widespread knowledge of these precedents from undermining Christianity's resurrection claims. Translation efforts of Egyptian funerary texts were restricted to approved scholars who agreed to specific interpretive frameworks that minimize their spiritual significance. Library restrictions, manuscript confiscation, and the deliberate destruction of translated copies that might circulate among lay people actively prevented popular access. The Vatican's secret archives allegedly contain extensive documentation of Egyptian resurrection rituals that church scholars studied intensively while publicly condemning these same practices as necromancy and demonic deception. Medieval ecclesiastical libraries preserved Egyptian magical papyri alongside Christian theological works, revealing systematic analysis of techniques that church doctrine officially rejected as heretical. This calculated appropriation allowed Christian authorities to understand and potentially utilize Egyptian methods while eliminating their original practitioners and context. Through this process of theological transformation, Osiris became associated with death magic rather than divine resurrection, while Anubis was reframed as a demonic entity that misled souls rather than a protective guide through afterlife trials. The Church's strategy of secretly studying Egyptian resurrection methodologies while publicly demonizing them demonstrates recognition that these ancient systems possessed genuine effectiveness that threatened Christian spiritual monopoly. Yet resurrection represented only one aspect of Egyptian spiritual technology that challenged Christian authority. The priests of Egypt had also mastered something even more fundamental to divine power. That power was Heka, the Egyptian understanding that properly spoken words could directly change reality without requiring priests as intermediaries. Egyptian practitioners believed that specific vocal techniques, combined with intentional breath control, could influence the fabric of existence itself. Their training involved learning exact pronunciations and mastering the breath control necessary to channel divine creative energy through the human vocal apparatus. Heka represented direct access to divine creative power, allowing ordinary individuals to influence physical reality through precise vocal techniques that required no institutional authority. Egyptian temples maintained schools where initiates learned to modulate their voices to specific frequencies and combine spoken formulas with ritual gestures to amplify their effectiveness. These techniques enabled people to perform healing work, influence weather patterns, and facilitate spiritual transformations without requiring approval from religious hierarchies. This concept posed an existential threat to emerging Christian authority because it empowered ordinary people to engage directly with creative divine forces through personal study and disciplined practice. The Egyptian understanding of creative speech paralleled the Christian concept of the divine word, yet fundamental differences emerged in their practical applications. While Christianity positioned the divine word as exclusively accessible through church authority, Heka demonstrated that individuals could access divine power independently. Christian missionaries observed Egyptian practitioners effectively addressing diseases that defied standard medical treatment and accurately forecasting future occurrences through divination methods. These demonstrations were especially troublesome because they implied that spiritual efficacy could exist independently of Christian institutional frameworks. Church authorities could not dismiss these results as mere superstition, forcing them to develop alternative explanations that preserved Christian theological supremacy. Rather than acknowledge the legitimacy of these ancient practices, church leaders reframed Heka as demonic deception designed to mislead the faithful away from true spiritual salvation. This strategy allowed Christian authorities to acknowledge the observable results while attributing effectiveness to malevolent supernatural forces rather than legitimate divine connection. The transformation served dual purposes, eliminating direct competition for spiritual authority while enabling church scholars to appropriate these techniques for exclusive institutional use. Historical records show how hypocritical this method is. Church scholars studied Heka practices intensively, integrating these techniques into exorcism rituals and private devotional practices while publicly condemning their origins as demonic sorcery. Medieval ecclesiastical manuscripts preserve detailed Egyptian formulas for vocal healing and breath-based spiritual practices that church authorities adapted for internal use while denying access to lay people who might threaten the ecclesiastical monopoly on divine power. The demonization of Heka established the precedent that direct divine access outside church authority constituted heretical practice, regardless of its effectiveness or spiritual validity. This suppression created the foundation for centuries of persecution against practitioners of indigenous spiritual traditions that emphasized personal divine connection over institutional mediation. Yet the Church's appropriation extended far beyond stealing practices and rebranding deities. Christian authorities recognized that the visual symbols and imagery that had defined Egyptian spirituality for millennia possessed profound psychological power that could serve their purposes. If this is resonating with you so far, take a second and tap that like button. It helps this message reach more souls who need it. And if you're feeling this energy, hit subscribe and drop a quick yes or I'm in the comments so I know you're walking this path with us. The most recognizable evidence of this calculated theft appears in the visual symbols that millions of Christians encounter daily without realizing their Egyptian origins. The winged imagery that became synonymous with Christian angels originated in Egyptian depictions of protective deities like Isis and Nephthys, who had adorned temple walls for thousands of years before Christianity emerged. These goddesses were portrayed with expansive wings that symbolized divine protection, spiritual elevation, and the bridge between earthly and celestial realms. Early Christian artists adopted these exact wing motifs for seraphim and cherubim while simultaneously condemning the very Egyptian goddesses who originally possessed these attributes. This contradiction reveals the calculated nature of the appropriation. Christian authorities recognized the psychological power of these ancient symbols while systematically demonizing their sources. The visual elements that conveyed divine authority and supernatural power were maintained but attributed to entirely different spiritual entities under Christian theological frameworks. The Ankh symbol underwent gradual transformation into the Christian cross through intermediate forms that deliberately obscured its original meaning. Egyptian understanding of the Ankh emphasized the union of masculine and feminine principles and the key that unlocked immortal life through spiritual wisdom. Christian adaptation retained the symbol's association with eternal life, while eliminating its connections to Egyptian concepts that emphasized personal spiritual development and direct divine access. Halos surrounding divine figures in Christian iconography directly descended from Egyptian solar discs that indicated divine illumination in pharaonic art. Egyptian artistic traditions used these radiant circles to demonstrate divine consciousness and connection to solar deities who represented higher wisdom and cosmic order. Christian artists maintained the visual impact while transferring the meaning to Christian saints, effectively stealing the psychological and spiritual associations while denying their pre-Christian origins. The Egyptian concept of divine judgment, featuring scales that weighed hearts against the feather of Ma'at, was incorporated into Christian depictions of final judgment while systematically erasing its Egyptian origins. Egyptian understanding emphasized that divine justice operated through cosmic law rather than arbitrary divine will. Christian adaptation preserved the powerful imagery while modifying the theological framework to support institutional religious authority rather than personal moral development. Water transformation ceremonies, healing through laying on of hands, and resurrection rituals were recontextualized as uniquely Christian divine interventions despite their extensive documentation in Egyptian religious practices. Egyptian priests had performed these ceremonies for centuries before Christian missionaries arrived. Church authorities observed their effectiveness and incorporated them into Christian frameworks while claiming divine revelation as their source. The Church understood that these symbols carried specific spiritual power and psychological associations that could serve their purposes. Once adoption was complete, authorities systematically removed references to Egyptian origins from Christian contexts, ensuring that subsequent generations would forget the original sources. This process allowed Christianity to benefit from the psychological impact of ancient Egyptian imagery while denying its debt to pre-Christian traditions. Yet the appropriation extended beyond mere visual symbols into something far more fundamental. The very structure of Christian religious practice itself contained hidden elements that revealed the Church's secret dependence on the spiritual technologies they publicly condemned. The Catholic Mass is the most well-known example of this hidden inheritance. It includes the spoken invocation that changes bread and wine into divine essence. This practice had been used in Egyptian temple ceremonies for thousands of years before Christianity began. Egyptian priests understood that certain substances could be transformed into vehicles for divine presence through precise ritual formulas, and they employed the ritual consumption of sacred offerings that were believed to confer spiritual benefits upon participants. The positioning of altars, the use of specific vestments during sacred ceremonies, and the employment of ritual gestures to channel divine energy all maintained their Egyptian origins while being recontextualized within Christian theological frameworks. The use of incense and ritual bells in Christian ceremonies directly paralleled Egyptian temple protocols for invoking divine presence and maintaining sacred space. Egyptian priests understood that certain aromatic substances could facilitate communication between earthly and divine realms when burned according to prescribed methods, while bells tuned to specific frequencies created environments conducive to spiritual transformation. These techniques were adopted wholesale by Christian authorities who recognized their effectiveness while denying their pre-Christian origins. Exorcism rituals employed techniques derived from Egyptian banishing ceremonies, including specific vocal formulas, protective symbols, and ritual implements that predated Christian theological development by centuries. Egyptian practitioners had developed sophisticated methods for removing unwanted spiritual influences through combinations of spoken commands, drawn symbols, and specialized tools designed to redirect negative energies away from afflicted individuals. Church exorcists adopted these techniques while attributing their effectiveness to Christian divine intervention rather than acknowledging their ancient sources. Marginalia in medieval manuscripts reveal Egyptian formulas written alongside Christian prayers, providing concrete evidence of systematic incorporation while maintaining public denial of such connections. Certain Vatican ceremonies employ ritual sequences identical to documented Egyptian temple practices, including specific hand movements, vocalization patterns, and ceremonial timing that matches Egyptian sacred protocols. These preserved documents demonstrate how church scholars deliberately maintained access to effective spiritual technologies while denying this knowledge to lay people. Monastic communities served as repositories for Egyptian knowledge, with certain orders maintaining traditions of breathwork, sound healing, and ritual geometry under the guise of Christian devotional practices. This systematic deception allowed institutional Christianity to preserve ancient techniques through coded manuscripts, oral traditions passed between trusted initiates, and ritualized practices that maintained their essential effectiveness while appearing to conform to Christian orthodoxy. The contradiction becomes clear. While the Church publicly condemned Egyptian spiritual practices as demonic, they secretly preserved and used these same techniques for their purposes. The Church deliberately hid effective spiritual practices from lay people who might use such knowledge to bypass ecclesiastical authority, revealing that their opposition was about maintaining exclusive access to transformative technologies rather than genuine theological objection. The effectiveness of Egyptian techniques proved that spiritual transformation and divine communication could occur without institutional mediation, threatening the Church's monopoly on salvation and divine access. This pattern of suppression and selective preservation established precedents that would extend far beyond the ancient world. The academic study of Egyptian religion remains carefully managed to emphasize historical and cultural aspects while downplaying practical applications that could empower individual practitioners. University courses on ancient Egyptian religion typically present magical practices as primitive superstitions rather than sophisticated spiritual technologies. This academic framing serves institutional interests by maintaining the perception that ancient spiritual practices lack contemporary relevance while preserving scholarly monopoly over interpretation of these materials. Religious institutions continue monitoring and sometimes suppressing modern Egyptian spiritual movements, recognizing that these practices still pose threats to institutional authority. Contemporary religious leaders express concerns about New Age movements, neo-pagan revivals, and hermetic societies that draw heavily from Egyptian sources. These institutional responses reveal ongoing recognition that Egyptian spiritual practices retain their potential to demonstrate divine access without religious mediation. The persistence of this conflict reveals that the fundamental tension between institutional religious authority and individual spiritual empowerment remains as relevant today as it was during Christianity's emergence. The patterns of suppression, appropriation, and control that shaped early church responses to Egyptian spirituality continue operating through modern academic and religious institutions, suggesting that the underlying concerns driving this historical conflict extend far beyond ancient theological disputes. Understanding this systematic suppression reveals how spiritual authority has been artificially centralized and empowers you to distinguish between authentic spiritual technologies and institutional substitutes in your own development. The Vatican's fear of Egyptian practices was never about supernatural threats, but about recognizing that these ancient approaches offered direct access to spiritual transformation without requiring ecclesiastical mediation. This knowledge transforms how you approach contemporary spiritual seeking, helping you identify when modern authorities attempt to control rather than genuinely guide your spiritual development. Your awareness of these historical patterns enables you to make more informed choices about spiritual practices. We appreciate you allowing us to be part of your spiritual journey. Please subscribe so we can continue together. Until next time, beautiful souls. Namaste.